This is GARIS Masculist MGTOW Flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 86, entitled MGTOW/Masculism and the American Pogrom. Description. This flyer claims that MGTOW/Masculism will be seen as a frivolous, ignorable luxury during the time of the collapse of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. That will happen soon, resulting in a pogrom by American goy sages, that is intellectuals, against the hated Jewish banksters and their cronies. Flyer itself. MGTOW/Masculism and the American Pogrom. Thanks to the internet, a growing percentage of Western sages, that is intellectuals, are learning a hatred of Jewish central banksters, Jewish neocons, etc. Individual scholars can upload their work and opinions for the world to see, so that the traditional monopoly of sources of information that are controlled by these Jewish banksters, that is the news outlets, the media companies, Hollywood, publishing, etc., has been broken. These scholars who show us the Jewish elite's hatred of the goy, a Jewish word for non-Jews, have taught us just how strongly the Jewish elite, particularly their religious leaders, the rabbis or rabbis, hate the goy. The Talmud, the religious Jews' principal religious document, or series of documents, is full of vitriolic hatred against the goy, which explains why Jews have been the most hated people in history, and in my view, the most interculturally incompetent people in history. The religious Jew's Messiah, when he comes to earth, is prophesied to destroy the goy and to rule over the world from Jerusalem. Thus, built into the Jews' religion is a hatred of the goy, that is, non-Jews, 99.8% of the world population, which readily explains why the Jews have been so hated over several thousand years and have been thrown out of nearly every country in Europe over the past 1,000 years, according to Jewish scholars. When your very religion teaches you to hate everyone, that is 99.8% of the world's population, it's then not surprising that the world hates you right back. Jewish prayers teach religious Jews to not pay back debts to the goy, to feel blessed that they are not goy, that goy are cattle to be manipulated and abused. Jewish anti-goyism is ancient and runs deep. It is Jewish anti-goyism that generates anti-Semitism in the goy. So what? Well, the Ashkenazi Jews, that is from Eastern Europe, are the smartest people in the world. In the US, they have an average IQ of 115. They have won a third of the Science Nobel Prizes. When they move into a country in large numbers, they take it over because of this intellectual superiority. They did this to Germany in the 1920s. After the Tsar of Russia cracked down on Russian Jews in 1905, after the previous Tsar was assassinated by Jews, so they fled to Germany. They have now done the same to the US. Ashkenazi Jewish genius is a two-edged sword. It can be used for the good of humanity. For example, Jewish genii have benefited humanity greatly with their discoveries in science and mathematics. This kind of Jew I have great admiration and respect for. But Jewish genius can also be used to harm humanity, and the strongest example of this are the Jewish banksters, who use their superior intelligence to massively abuse and enslave the hated goy. In the 1600s in Poland, the landed gentry, that is goy, employed the Jewish community in Poland to serve as tax collectors, extracting money from the Polish peasants. These Jews were utterly alien to these Polish Catholic peasants and were hated. Things got so bad that eventually there was one of the worst pogroms in Jewish history when about 50,000 Jews were butchered. This kind of thing has been happening to Jews wherever they go. They make themselves hated. Then the locals pogrom them, or the king throws them out, when the Jewish elite in their country become too economically powerful and threaten the power of the king. This has happened again and again and again. Jewish communities have been thrown out of European countries, dukedoms, cities over 100 times in the past 1,000 years. Let that sink in. Over 100 times? So do they never learn? In today's world, this age-old pattern continues. There's a branch of Judaism that is Satanist. In the 1700s, Jacob Frank, a disciple of Shabbatai Tzvi, T-Z-V-I, who claimed he was the Jewish Messiah in the 1600s, preached the opposite of the Ten Commandments that are contained in the Jewish Torah. He taught that the Jewish Messiah would be more likely to return if Jews committed evil on a large scale. Frank influenced the early Rothschilds, who then used their enormous wealth, extracted from taxes paid by the peoples of nations to the central banks that were controlled by them, that is, the Rothschilds, to commit crimes against humanity on a jaw-dropping scale. For example, they became the major generators of the two world wars, financing them, bribing the major players, nearly all Jews, Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, Hitler, maybe a quarter Jew, to do their bidding, making debt slaves of whole populations due to their creation of paper currency debt note Ponzi schemes, their assassination of 6 US presidents, when they did not agree with Jewish control of the central banks, and hence the power to issue the currency, the inflations of currencies which wipe out the savings of old people, the bribing of politicians with money they print out of thin air, thus destroying democracies, the switching on and off of economic booms and busts like a light switch, stimulating booms, then buying up bankrupted businesses at pennies on the pound during the depressions they generate, for example, the Great Depression of the 1930s. Control of the sources of information, brainwashing the public about the World War II Holocaust. No Jews were gassed in the concentration camps. Speaking now, like this was written a year and a half ago. I am not a first-hand researcher of these issues. I get my information from first-hand researchers, people like David Irving and David Duke, and so on. Real researchers who spend their lives in the archives doing real research. I just absorb their opinions, but I absorb opinions from lots of people and then connect the dots, make the inferences from bits of information left and right and centre and so on. Okay. David Irving now is less sure about whether the Nazis did gas the Jews in eastern Poland. In western Poland, the evidence shows pretty clearly there was no gassing. For example, in Auschwitz, there was no gassing. And we know that because of Gorbachev. In the late 80s, he opened up the Russian archives. Researchers went in and found the death certificates of the prisoners who died at Auschwitz in the war years. There were 70,000 of them. Not millions, 70,000 death certificates. 40,000 of them were Jews. And being death certificates, the German doctors, wrote down the cause of death. And the two principal causes were typhoid and starvation. Why starvation? Because in the final months of the war, the Allies had shot the Luftwaffe out of the sky. So they had the sky to themselves, and they were bombing heavily the German infrastructure, the railways and so on. So the food trains could not get through to the West Polish concentration camps. So they starved, and being in a very weak state, their immune systems were weakened, and so they got typhus. So they died in droves. Okay. E.g., the Great Depression of the 1930s, control of the sources of information, brainwashing the public about the World War II Holocaust. No Jews were gassed in the concentration camps, with the proviso I just mentioned. The constant wars to enrich the Jewish owners of the military-industrial complex, etc., etc. The crimes against humanity of the Jewish central banksters and their cronies are so massive that anyone who's informed about them, including ordinary Jews, soon learns to hate them. Including ordinary Jews, who have been just as abused and murdered by the Jewish elite as the Goy. This hatred is growing amongst the Goy sages, that is intellectuals, in the US, who increasingly are expressing their hatred and pushing for the hated Jewish bankster elite to be sent to The Hague, the International Criminal Court, to be prosecuted for crimes against humanity and then be executed. This hatred coming from the Goy sages is growing and growing. I anticipate an American pogrom occurring when the Jewish banksters succeed in destroying the economies of the US, Europe, Japan in the coming few years, perhaps even months, ? The longer-term goal of the Jewish banksters is to take over the world and to rule it from Jerusalem. That is the Talmudic prophecy that guided the strategies of these Jewish banksters. They are quietly, deliberately destroying the major Western powers so that Israel will be the surviving major power. It is already the fourth largest nuclear power in the world. The fourth. Once the dollar crashes as the world's reserve currency, the US will plunge into third world status. American Goy will then become furious and seek revenge against the Jewish banksters, who will be pogromed. I see this as highly likely. Once the dollar crashes and the US descends into chaos and civil war, with millions being killed, the Jewish banksters will be butchered and their criminal banking system will be dismantled. This will then allow a renaissance of the US, so that its citizens can throw out the politicians who have for a century been bribed by Jewish central banksters. New politicians will be installed who will be fairer to men and will give men fair gender laws. But this two-step process, that is, the short-term chaos/civil war, followed by the longer-term US revival, will take time, several decades. So during the time of chaos, MGTOW/masculism will be eclipsed by more demanding preoccupations, such as trying to stay alive, finding food, and trying to avoid being robbed at gunpoint by roving armed bands looking for food. The horrors of the US collapse will only fuel the hatred of the Goy against the Jewish central banksters who created the collapse in the first place, by design, in capitals, thus motivating these Goys to wipe out, that is, to pogrom these Jewish banksters. Thus, for the several decades that it will take for the US and Europe to revive, you can say goodbye to MGTOW/masculism will be seen as luxuries that are too frivolous to be taken seriously in desperate US pogroming times. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name De Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers. Ciao.